Ladies and gentlemen, today is July 13th, 2025, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of Will Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
How are you?
Pretty good. Yourself?
Oh, can't complain.
Did you manage to get any of those walks in?
Kinda, sorta. I did go to Sam's Club and walk around for about 15-20 minutes.
Sam's Club is a verifiable, certifiable labyrinth, so I'll give you credit. That's one of the best inventions. Sam's Club and Costco. The format of that. Just so much stuff in large quantities. So for people who don't go outside, like us, that stocks you up. It's great. And it's usually more reasonable prices than if you're buying more like smaller increments of the same material. Wholesale. Well, cool.
Yeah, it's pretty efficient. That's second degree price discrimination, as I recall.
What does that mean?
Well, first degree price discrimination is where you charge different prices for each individual based off of how much you think they can pay.
Oh.
That's right. You go into a store, normally everybody gets the same price. But with first degree price discrimination, there is no single fixed price. The seller just sells according to whatever they think they can get out of you. Second degree price discrimination is where you change the price based off of the volume of the sale. So Sam's Club basically does that. They will basically make you choose to buy more stuff in exchange for a slightly lower price. So you actually end up spending more money than you would otherwise if you were going to, like, say, Kroger or something and buying a smaller volume of the good you want. But technically, per unit, per unit of measure of weight, you're paying a little bit less by buying higher volume.
Yeah, price for volume is better.
Yeah. So that's second degree price discrimination.
Is there a third degree?
Yeah, that's like discriminating based off of characteristics. So like age discounts, student discounts, those are technically third degree price discrimination.
Military discount?
Technically as well, yes.
Okay. Cool, I didn't know about any of those distinctions. The more you know. It's been a pretty good week for me. Had some nice streams. I'm still sore from Friday's stream, where I was doing 10 push-ups for every death in Dota 2. And then chat decided it would be a great day to redeem a bunch of push-ups with their channel points as well, so I ended up doing over 400.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I'm still technically in debt by about 50 push-ups from that.
So you've been working out this week.
Yes, sir. Got my protein shakes and stuff too. So I'm making gains. I'm probably maybe 10 pounds heavier than I was in LA, just of muscle, because I've been eating more and yeah, working out. So.
Well, I'm probably about at least 10 pounds heavier than you were when you were in LA, but for very different reasons.
There are many roads to weight gain.
Yes. I've traveled many of them, although not so much the one you've been traveling.
There's still time.
That's true.
A lot of people hit their marathon running peak when they're 45, just as a reference. I love that stat just because people have the conception that once you're out of your 20s, you're just fucked. And people kind of give up, they resign themselves to age and so on. But discipline and planning and routine are a huge part of developing fitness, and a lot of those things improve as you gain in maturity rather than degrade. So that's why you have a lot of people who maybe historically had not been in shape in their life, but then when they get into their 40s, they think about, okay, my body's kind of not functioning as well as it used to, but if I get a routine in my life that makes it better, then you can build some body composition changes and so on. So when I went to the marathon with Kukio back in the day, I was surprised at how many people were middle-aged and even some elderly in there. There's even this one Sikh guy who was famous for, I think, being a centenarian marathon runner. So he was 100 years old or something, still doing that shit. Obviously not fast, but to even be able to move your body for that long of a time was a huge feat of human endurance. Should probably double check what his age was, but yeah. Pretty cool.
Yeah. I think you said that you ran in a marathon up there recently.
No, there was a little event that's called the Volksmarch. It's a walk or run around the Crazy Horse Monument, so it's got a lot of elevation incline to it. Most people walk it, but there were probably like a dozen or so people who were running it.
Huh.
So I did that. Pretty cool. I go for a run every Tuesday. My current route is 7 miles. And it's getting easier and easier the more that I do it. The first time that you do a run, it's hellish. Your knees hurt, your ankles hurt, your lungs hurt, your heart feels like it can't keep up. But then every time after that, it gets like 5% easier. To where at this point, I feel like the first half of my run is easy. The second half of my run, I'm pushing myself. But then the body has this cool trick of releasing endorphins. When it realizes that you're under stress, it gives you these feel-good chemicals that make you feel like you can keep going. So there's always that kind of light at the end of the tunnel of you suffer for a few miles or kilometer, depending on whether you think in metric or not, and then you get a little bit of a reward. It's like free drugs from nature.
Yeah, little dopamine hit for you. Keep you active.
Mm-hmm. The stream's been going well. The honor mode run I'm doing with the lads. We just completed Act 2. So that was good.
Oh, really?
Merkel was a stomp for us. It was really nice.
Oh, cool. Sounds like that's moving along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting getting basically no story from the companions, because we have all 4 people in it, and then you also don't get the camp buffs and having an alchemist and stuff like that. So a lot of those things, Withers just won't let you swap out the player characters. So it has that element of the difficulty being increased, but the item randomizer that we have, I feel like is a slight buff. It feels like it's a little bit stronger than the vanilla run that you and I are doing.
Gotcha. Well, have you been doing anything else this week other than the usual?
I've been getting more into reading and actually writing again for the first time in a long time. Just kind of trying to flex my muscles with that. So that's been pretty cool. This week, I'm also kind of on ranch hand duty because family's away, so I'm keeping track of stuff, make sure things don't catch on fire, the dogs are okay, that sort of deal. There's a lot of self-reliance that has to happen when you live this far from civilization. We can drive into town for, it's like maybe 10 minutes or so, so it's not super remote, but it's a town of 2,000 people, so still pretty low population compared to other major metropolitan areas.
Gotcha. Well, what kind of stuff do you have to do on a ranch like that?
Well, there's a greenhouse, so everything in that needs to be watered. The hail is a very common weather event here, so if that happens, you have to cover the plants that are outside. There's an outdoor garden as well. And then there's a chicken coop, and the chickens need feed, and they need water. And they have a little automated door that closes every night at sunset. And the chickens go into the warmer kind of inner chicken coop area whenever the sun starts setting. So they're actually pretty much 100% on point for that, unless one of them is like so sick it's about to die. They have a really good instinct for when the sun goes down, they turn in for the evening, and then the door closes automatically. They've been laying a whole bunch of eggs recently. I think it was like 9 eggs yesterday. And now eggs are so expensive, that's practically printing money, right?
Yeah, fresh eggs are pretty good. I've had them before.
It'll take a long time for them to pay for themselves because the chicken coop we made is really big and it's very secure from predators and stuff. We had a chicken coop in Seattle and it wasn't very secure. It was like a loose wire fence, and boy howdy, raccoons will just reach in there and grab a chicken by the neck and pull them right through and they die. It's very gruesome, but yeah, security is a thing. And if it's not secure, animals will find their way in. Because the dogs sleep inside at night, so they can't protect the chicken coop at night. But during the day, nothing really comes around. We don't even have deer that come in the property anymore because of the Australian shepherds we have.
Get a donkey.
We're thinking about that, actually.
Donkeys are good at protecting animals.
Yeah. Just natural bodyguards. Donkeys and then also llamas do the same thing.
Really?
Yep, llamas are heckin' mean as fuck to anything that's not a friend of the property.
Interesting.
Yep, I've just heard llamas are stinkier.
I was really surprised when I first heard that donkeys were good at that.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed counterintuitive to me, but apparently they will just go completely apeshit on coyotes and whatnot.
Yep. Yeah, a lot of animals in nature have aggression that is irrational and unwise, but it's overall beneficial to the species. I think roosters are a great example of that, where they will just fight anything to the death. They don't give a fuck, even if they have really low chances, just because their job is to fight to protect all the chickens and stuff. They're one of those types.
Yeah. Well, I guess if other animals know you're hyper-aggressive, they're less likely to bother, since even if they're going to win, they'll probably get injured.
Yeah, an injury in nature is really dangerous because you can't go to the vet. Hey, I'm really hurt from this fight. Can I go to the vet now? Go to the Pokemon Healing Center.
Well, I don't have anything to report on my end, really. I've just been trying to get through the Mass Effect franchise.
Nice. Are you on 2 still?
No, I finished 2. I'm into 3 now. It's been a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes.
Who did you end up romancing in 2?
Let me think now. Talia.
Ah! That's who I recommended.
Yeah, that's who I wanted to romance in the first game, but that wasn't an option.
Mm-hmm.
So they finally let me do it in the second one.
Nice. That reminds me, there was a thread this past week in the Baldur's Gate 3 subreddit where they were complaining that Jaheira can't be romanced. And then people in the comments were like, you can do that in Baldur's Gate 2.
Yeah, I think that's true. I don't really know the characters in the first 2 games as well, but I remember she was among them.
Mm-hmm. I like her vibe. I think she's in my top 5 of favorite BG3 characters.
Yeah, she's pretty cool.
Chat says, of your Talia, excellent choice, Mr. Smith.
Well, who doesn't love space gypsies?
I like that she has a tenderness and vulnerability to her character that makes you want to protect her and kind of talk about that and stuff. Because I think, if you don't want Mass Effect 2 spoilers, chat, I don't know what to say. It's an old game now. But she can't take her mask off because I think they're like really vulnerable to disease or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
her
that
being
much isn't a spoiler.
her being able to risk that with the player character if you're on good terms is a pretty big step.
I think I've also been doing... Oh, right. I found Galciv 2 in my library, so I made the mistake of booting that up again.
Ooh.
That game can really eat into your life. I don't know if you've heard of that, but that's an old strategy game.
Gal Civ 2?
Galactic Civilizations 2. It's an old space 4X builder. The franchise is still going. I think they've since released Gal Civ 3 and Gal Civ 4. I haven't really played those, though, because the company really shifted over to a heavy and expensive DLC model. And that really racks up in terms of price pretty quickly. I think with the third game, they had like 10, 20 DLCs. It cost me like $50 to get it all when it was discounted. For a long time, I didn't want to do it because I didn't want to reward that kind of model, but I finally caved in because I wanted to try the third game after having not played the second one for so long. And I wasn't all that impressed, so I'm very, very reluctant to get 4, even though it looks very pretty. Whenever I see it on YouTube or something like that, it seems and looks very pretty, but I'm resisting temptation because of the experience with 3. And so now I've just gone back to 2, which was the one that really got me interested in the first place. Very addictive gameplay. I think I got Michael into it for a while, way back when.
How is it compared to Endless Space? Because I think that's the closest that I played.
It's very different. Endless Space is very streamlined. It's easy to learn how to play. And once you learn it, it's easy to kind of just breeze through a game in a couple days. Gal Civ, by contrast, is more like Sid Meier's Civ games. You know, the games can really drag out. Not in a bad way, unless it's late game. But yeah, it's much more involved. There's a lot more mechanics. There's a lot more things that you can do. You know, it's pretty... It allows you to be very creative. One of the things that makes it stand out... I'm getting way off topic here. Just to go on a quick tangent. It has an in-game ship builder that allows you to use a 3D engine to actually build your own ships. And when I say build them, I don't mean like just add different components and stuff, although that's a factor as well, but you can actually change how they look. Which back in the day was pretty novel. And there's not a lot of games that let you do that in the 4X genre, in the space 4X genre even today. Certainly not like that anyway. So yeah, it's just a unique experience. I missed it. I was just going to play it for like an hour or two, and then I ended up playing like 6 hours or something.
Nice.
The more things change, the more they stay the same. I used to do that in college too. Anyway, the world. What? We always start with the games.
I think it's a good start. I like that. It feels cozy, relatable, keeps you grounded.
There you go. Well, what particular international drama did you want to talk about this week?
Personally, no one has mentioned anything this whole week, so my impression is that it's a very slow week, but I didn't do the investigation myself, so I'm not sure.
Well, they're pretty much correct. Most of the new developments this past week have been things relating to trade, but a lot of that is not surprising. It's basically just more of the same. The Trump administration posturing, and then everybody else just being exasperated. So we'll see how genuine the threats are this time. Probably not very. But if they're not, then the markets are going to be in for a ride. What all did I have here? I was so focused on getting through the trade notes, I forgot to look at some of the other ones. Yeah, mostly more of the same. Yeah, so if chat doesn't have anything in particular they want to get to, then I'll probably just do a trade recap, and then we can just kind of freewheel from there, freestyle from there.
Sure, suits me.
All right. Let me see real quick.
People are saying that the Epstein cover-up has been the main topic.
The Epstein thing I've always thought is kind of pointless, because you're probably never really going to know what happened in any case. I mean, to me, it doesn't seem that unreasonable that he probably did just kill himself. I'm not denying that, there probably was an exchange of sexual favors when he was alive, but I don't think everybody that flew with him or knew him was a pedophile either. So, this idea that you're going to learn something big about international pedophile rings or some such thing, that seems ridiculous to me. I don't think it's all that meaningful an issue.
Mm-hmm.
But people are obsessed with it. They insist there's some kind of elite cover-up here. So they've been getting kind of not strung, but what's the word I want? Well, they've been kind of getting manipulated because the Trump administration, the Trump campaign in 24 partly tried to use that to get back into office, and now he's back into office and he doesn't really give a shit about it. So some people have been getting mad about it, but I don't think it's going to change anything. I don't think anybody that voted for him, or at least most of the people that voted for him, are going to turn on him because of this. There'll be some short-term drama, but ultimately it'll just go nowhere.
What are the claims being thrown around right now?
Well, basically Trump said, or somebody in his administration anyway, said that they would release the Epstein files that the FBI had accumulated over the course of their investigations. And in particular, people were eager to see a list of names of people that flew with Epstein at one time or another, because they thought that would give some kind of insight into who's a pedophile, who's well-connected, who was getting paid off or bribed, whatever kind of conspiracy bullshit. They could release the full list and it would change nothing. So I don't know why people think it would change anything if they did. But regardless, there was a promise that they would release it. They teased that they would release it a few months ago. They ended up releasing like a heavily redacted version of the files to some right-wing influencers, I think YouTubers and whatnot, hilariously. And so now more recently, there's been talk from the administration and some of its officials that actually they're not going to release the files because there's not really anything useful in there. And that seems like a betrayal to some people who were really hoping for those files to be released. And so there's been some backlash, which will almost certainly be temporary and ephemeral, because ultimately they will just go back to supporting him. Nothing will change on account of it. But it's been good TV, as Trump would say, in the meantime. Let's see, where did I... Oh, here we go. So what's been going on with trade? We haven't talked about it in a while. I think a couple months, actually. So I won't get into all the nitty-gritty details. I was, before we started, trying to kind of write up a truncated version of all the notes that I've got accumulated on trade over the past couple months, just to kind of give an expedited summary of where all the trade negotiations have been going. So the most recent thing has been letters, specifically letters sent to all of the parties that the Trump administration is negotiating with about the so-called reciprocal tariffs that were announced a while back. So they had said that sometime in July, if there had been no deal reached with given trade partners, they would implement the tariff hikes that had been outlined in the original announcement of reciprocal tariffs. Which, while announced, were not actually implemented. They were more of a threat at the time. So here we are in July. So letters were issued in advance of the new deadline, threatening that tariffs would be implemented, but also noting that while they would be implemented, they will not actually go into force until August the 1st. So that felt to markets like another delay, which has been a persistent feature of the trade negotiations thus far. So whether that's a climb down or just an elaboration kind of depends on your point of view. But this does mean that tariffs are not going to immediately impact on the original July deadline. They have been delayed further for a couple weeks. I think markets are going to expect that they'll be delayed further if negotiations are ongoing. The administration insists that this is basically just part of the negotiation. They're trying to put the heat on negotiating partners. But I would note here that it was in June that Scott Bessent, the Secretary of the Treasury, noted that they would actually do this. He said that very specifically, that if trade negotiating partners negotiated in good faith, that it was likely that tariffs would be delayed until August the 1st. So that's from June, and now it's actually happened, so it seems he was telling the truth there. And again, it seems likely to me that they'll be delayed further, depending on the state of negotiations. The European Union followed up the recent announcement by delaying their own retaliatory tariffs that were supposed to be implemented around the same time. So they've also been now delayed until early August. So everybody's kind of kicking the can a little further down the road here while negotiations are ongoing. We don't really know the substance of the negotiations at this point because it seems to be mostly secret. We get little peeks here and there, and I'll try to talk about them as we go forward here. But the big picture right now is that the big deadline has been delayed further, and so the immediate drama has been avoided. One particular note here about the letters that were issued. They were not issued to every country in the world. The administration has around 24, a little less than 24 specific countries that it has in mind that it really wants deals with. And those were the ones that got letters. Those are the ones that they're really focusing on in these negotiations. And all of the letters focused only on trade, except for the letter to Brazil. And in addition to announcing the delay in tariffs and threatening and the usual, their letter also pressured them to end investigations into Jair Bolsonaro, whom you may remember had been president up until a few years ago. He is a populist like Trump and is nominally kind of akin to Trump. I don't know if he's really an ally per se. Nationalists don't really get along with each other for the most part. But for whatever reason, the Trump administration saw fit to try to demand that the Brazilian government end investigations into Bolsonaro and some of his behavior regarding an alleged coup plot that would have kept him in power after the last election, which he lost. So I don't think the Brazilian government is going to do that. Most likely people will resent being pressured by a foreign government. That's generally the reaction to interventions in other countries' internal affairs. But I thought it was notable. It's worth pointing out here. It seems that there's some kind of motive for the Trump administration in its policy vis-a-vis Brazil beyond just trade. So whether that's just superficial bullshit that doesn't actually mean anything, maybe he just did it on a whim, maybe Bolsonaro talked him into it, but there won't be any actual follow-on. Or maybe this is a substantive part of the negotiation going forward. Which of those is the case is not going to be clear for a while, but it is interesting to note. We'll see what weight that has going forward. Let's see. Oh, and in a miscellaneous note here, this is something that happened back in May, and I don't think we ever talked about it. So there were talks pending with the European Union, and the day before Trump went to those talks, he threatened to hike tariffs on the European Union to 50%, or by 50%. But he conditioned that on a potential major investment in the United States, which he said could delay those threatened tariffs. Now, there was no official response from the European Union, so it seems it was just posturing. And as of now, several months later, nothing has come of it. So it was mostly just cheap talk on the part of the president there. But I wanted to bring that up because that does illustrate his style. He's done that repeatedly and will most likely continue to do it. And it also illustrates how his style is kind of defined in part by extortion. He seems to really think that if he just heaps pressure on other countries or leaders, then he can extract some kind of concession without actually offering anything in return. So a frequent pattern there.
The old give me your lunch money routine.
Yeah, pretty much. So let's see, talks with other countries. Well, before we get to that, So what is the U.S. pushing for in these negotiations? We're getting a better idea over time of just what it is Washington seems to be gunning for here. And some of these items I'm going to mention are being pursued more in negotiations with some countries as opposed to others. But in general, all of these come up in varying degrees with all of America's trading partners here. So obviously, reductions in tariffs is one item. In particular, the administration seems to want other countries to reduce tariffs on agricultural goods, cars, alcoholic beverages. Beverages comes up a lot. It's a very niche industry, but where it's prominent, it tends to be economically important, like, say, Kentucky, for example. So it does have some pull disproportionate to its size. Cars is a big industry, no surprise there. Obviously, the car industry in any given country wants more access rather than less to foreign markets. Agriculture, though, is the most controversial one because there had been an understanding in international free trade negotiations that agriculture was a sensitive space because every country wants, one, to be strategically self-sufficient in food, just in case, and two, rural political districts of one kind or another. The subdivision varies from country to country, but rural areas generally have a fair degree of political pull, regardless of country, and governments generally prefer to protect them in order to get their votes. So anything that increases access to your own agricultural market generally results in a significant pushback by rural voters, and governments are very averse to that. Now, every government pretty much faces the same dynamic, and so it was normal, and remains normal for the most part, for free trade agreements to have carve-outs for the agricultural sector. Basically, the free trade agreements involve lowering tariffs on broad swaths of goods, with some exceptions, but the biggest exception is almost always agriculture. That is almost always exempted for the most part. Bilateral deals have seen some reductions in tariffs on agricultural goods between individual countries, but by and large, agricultural sectors in every country remain heavily subsidized, relatively heavily protected by tariff, and also receive favorable regulatory treatment by their home country, their home government. So given that that is to say agriculture in the United States is a powerful industry, it's no surprise that Washington wants to increase access in foreign markets. However, pushing hard to get other governments to grant that access is going to be very difficult for all of the reasons I just outlined. It's just too politically sensitive. And the Trump administration either doesn't know that or doesn't care. They're pushing very hard for it, and it's making it very difficult to close a lot of these deals that they're negotiating because their counterparties basically are not willing to do it, virtually regardless of threat or concession that Washington might make. So another thing that Washington is pushing for here is reductions in non-tariff barriers. So this is very similar to agriculture in that it's a very sensitive space because this touches on things like taxes and regulations that are much more sensitive to domestic political considerations in other countries. A lot of stuff like tariffs is not necessarily that prominent in domestic politics in any given country. Up until Trump was president, that was the same in the United States. But things like taxes and regulation will get you into much more trouble as a politician in another country. And so they've been much more reluctant to give ground on that. And that's been well known for a long time. It's been known for decades, if not generations, that non-tariff barriers to trade are very difficult to negotiate down in free trade agreements, and that it was kind of a stretch goal in any free trade agreement. For the most part, free trade agreements over the past 50 years have focused mostly on tariffs. And while they've been fairly successful in doing that, they really faltered when they shifted away from that and started trying to negotiate down non-tariff barriers to trade. There's been some success in that regard. China has negotiated some agreements, although they've been very limited in how much they've achieved in non-tariff barriers. The United States may have negotiated the most successful agreement in that vein in the form of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which actually focused mostly on addressing non-tariff barriers to trade. But then, of course, the Trump administration in its first term scrapped that. And so we're kind of back to square one in that regard. Now, to a degree, the Trump administration may end up negotiating what ends up being a kind of revised Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which is basically the same, but which has a different label on it. That's effectively what they did with the NAFTA renegotiation, where they said that they created a whole new agreement, but it was in effect just NAFTA with some changes. So some examples of non-tariff barriers, taxes, so things like digital services taxes, that is to say taxes on internet companies or other forms of digital service, and value-added tax, which Washington insists gives an unfair advantage to foreign companies, which don't have to pay that. In most, if not all circumstances, when they export goods. So Washington argues that's an unfair tax. Regulations, so things like corporate sustainability reporting rules, which kind of adds red tape. Those apply to domestic firms as well, though, so that's not as strong of an argument out of Washington. Better argument is things like protective agricultural standards, which you can impose in a way that is restrictive on foreign imports, but is not restrictive on your own producers. Protective technical standards, these are basically safety requirements that you can implement in a way that makes it very difficult for foreign producers to enter your market. These are basically just rules of thumb on how to judge the safety of a given product. And you can design them in a way that's favorable to your own producers. So these are examples of things that Washington is pushing to change, pushing other governments to change in order to improve the access of American companies to those markets. Unsurprisingly, they're getting a lot of pushback. Also things like subsidies, which is partly a non-tariff barrier, but is also just kind of unfair. This is something that's been the target of free trade agreements for a long time, but invariably there have been carve-outs because of sensitive industries like agriculture, or in the case of China, in certain heavy manufacturing industries, which they consider key to their industrial policy. So examples of subsidies, both direct and indirect, include dumping, export and other varieties of subsidies, and currency manipulation, which can artificially devalue, which can artificially reduce the price of your exports by reducing the value of your currency. So some other things the administration wants to tackle in this regard includes things like counterfeiting, piracy, and IP theft. You could argue that some governments purposely don't enforce that much because it creates a more competitive market for their producers, since they can just steal stuff abroad and kind of catch up more quickly than they would otherwise. Although in a lot of cases, governments just don't have the administrative capacity to enforce laws on IP. It's kind of beyond their capacity in many cases.
Would that be stuff like knockoff Gucci and Versace stuff that's made in China?
Partly that. That does qualify, but it also qualifies to things like inventions. So if you invent a better mousetrap, a new device of some kind, you would patent that in the United States and it would nominally be protected. But in China, somebody may just copy the design and sell it at a cheaper price than what you can produce.
I see.
And then finally, transshipments to evade tariffs. So this is just a form of tariff evasion where if your country has a high tariff placed on it by the United States government, you can get around that by shipping it to another country that the U.S. is not tariffing, and then export the product into the United States from that country, whereupon you will not have to pay a high tariff, and presumably will retain your competitive advantage, your price advantage. So this is something that Washington wants help with, because a lot of Chinese goods that have been tariffed by Washington still find their way into the United States by way of re-export. They're exported to a third-party country and then exported onto the United States. The United States government would like countries to prevent that, either by doing a better job of tracking, where goods are coming from, or just by tariffing China so that those goods cannot enter their countries in the first place. As you might imagine, a lot of countries are very reluctant to do that because they would prefer to have access to cheap Chinese goods themselves. So American pressure in this regard kind of puts them in a bind. It may not end well for the United States, because I suspect Given the choice, a lot of countries would prefer China because China is the largest trading partner of broad swaths of the planet at this point. And the United States doesn't really export a lot of cheap stuff. And given that incomes in developing countries are relatively low, consumers in those countries generally prefer to have access to cheaper stuff rather than more expensive stuff, which means that their governments are under a degree of pressure to continue to maintain access to cheap Chinese imports, at least cheap Chinese consumer goods of one kind or another. Those same goods can create problems for manufacturers in those industries, but most developing countries don't really have strong manufacturing sectors anyway. So it's not as much of a catch-22 for governments in the developing world. There are some exceptions like Southeast Asia where they have seen kind of a renaissance in manufacturing, but a lot of that is actually just Chinese firms that have set up shop there or are investing in firms there in order to get around American tariffs. So all of this is stuff that Washington is pushing in these trade negotiations regarding the reciprocal tariffs. We still don't know all of the details about what they're pushing for. And again, the things that they prioritize are going to vary from country to country. So we shall see. I mean, it's all going to come to light eventually, probably in dramatic fashion, I'm sure. Oh, and another thing, Washington is also pushing light natural gas exports. Washington wants other countries to buy more American LNG, which is more feasible in some places than others. I suspect that's mostly just a manifestation of the influence of the natural gas industry in the US more than anything. Well, let's see. Besides the United States, then, what about the counterparties? What's been going on in the other countries that the U.S. has been negotiating with? So in Japan, they're fighting really hard to remove the baseline 10% U.S. tariff. Washington insists that regardless of what happens in the negotiations, there's still going to be a 10% tariff in place on everybody. Tokyo doesn't like that, and they insist that it needs to be removed. They're also insisting that American tariffs on automotive imports needs to be removed, at least for Japanese cars. Japanese insistence on these two items in particular seems to have resulted in stalled talks. And Trump has commented angrily on the state of those talks a couple of times now, but it hasn't really moved Tokyo as of yet. So they seem to be kind of in a standoff at this point. India, there was a lot of optimism about India pretty early on. It seemed like India might be the first country to actually conclude a deal with the Trump administration here. But since then, talks have stalled out there as well. And a lot of that has to do with some of the more sensitive parts of the Indian economy that Washington is pushing for more access to. India, for its part, wants to, like Japan, have Washington remove the baseline 10%. They don't like that either. But a bigger issue for India is the automotive market and the agricultural market. India has always protected its automotive market. It's notoriously protectionist in this regard. The United States wants them to lower those tariffs, but the Indian government considers an important part of their industrial policy to promote Indian manufacturing by pushing Indian automotive production. So for them, giving foreigners access to that would significantly inhibit the development of Indian manufacturing, and so they're stonewalling on this. They absolutely do not want to do it. However, it's a problem for India, specifically for India's government, because while they do want to protect their automotive industry, they also want to continue to maintain access to the US market for Indian manufacturers of car parts. Most car parts imported into the United States from abroad come from places like China, Japan, Germany, etc. But with all of the drama with Chinese imports over the past year and change, well, I should say over the past 10 years, really, there's been more and more of a shift into India of car part manufacturing. However, now that's imperiled, and it's not clear that New Delhi will be able to maintain that access. Washington certainly seems to be insisting on it. So I suspect ultimately India is going to trade away what little advancement has occurred in its car part manufacturing export sector in exchange for the right to continue to protect its automotive market. because this is not just about industrial policy. This is also a matter of constituents within Indian politics. There are a lot of powerful interests in India's manufacturing sector that very much benefit from protection and lobby the government, if not just outright bribe the government in India to continue to maintain that protection. And a lot of those interests would be very upset if the Indian government actually did open up in this regard. I would point out this is not just Indian car companies, corporations. It's also unions in India, which are actually pretty large and powerful. So automotive unions in India would also be very opposed to Indian protectionism. And so that would be a big penalty for any politician in India. So that's what's holding up the talks, at least as far as the automotive sector. The Indian government also had been exporting some steel and aluminum, so they want U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum to be lowered or removed. Obviously, Washington doesn't want to do that. They consider that a big part of restoring and rejuvenating the U.S. steel and aluminum sector, although that's not going to happen, but that's another conversation. So they've been stonewalling on that. And then agriculture, I already explained this, right? This is just a sensitive sector for every country. The U.S. wants to open up another potential market for exports of its own goods. India wants to protect its farmers, many of whom are subsistence farmers and would be disproportionately hurt by a flood of cheap American goods. And so this is another thing that they almost certainly will not end up doing. But in the meantime, this is holding up talks. Washington refuses to give ground on this. India doesn't want to give ground, so they're at a standoff. Let's see here. I would point out here, too, that India, while it wants to protect its automotive market to help with the country's industrialization, India doesn't really have a big automotive market. There's a decent number of cars sold there just in purely quantitative terms, but the size of its own automotive industry is relatively small. A lot of the production that happens in the country is actually licensed production of foreign models of cars. I think especially Suzuki, a Japanese automaker, is very prominent in India, specifically for that reason, because they shacked up with a local producer and did a licensing agreement.
Yeah, I remember you mentioning a while back that Japan automakers were a lot more successful in India than American ones were.
Yeah, they've been a lot more adaptive to local conditions. They've been more willing to build relationships over time and to cultivate that and to partner up with local producers in order to get in the good graces of New Delhi. And so that's resulted in them, over the course of about half a century, in getting the larger share of the market share in India. I think it's like a sizable majority of the automotive market in India is just Japanese producers, albeit Japanese producers operating through and with local partners. Let's see, I don't have a lot on Canada. The trading relationship with Canada and Mexico, for that matter, is still relatively stable compared to other countries because Mexico and Canada were able to secure a waiver on tariff hikes from Washington for goods that are CUSMA compliant. And the waiver that they got in that regard was extended, I think, last month or 2 months ago, somewhere around there. So that seems to be semi-permanent. And that's most of their trade with the U.S. So they seem to be in a relatively good position, but they're still facing tariffs on things like cars, for example, or at least cars that are not CUSMA compliant, which actually makes up a not insignificant portion of their exports into the United States. So they're still fighting for that. But negotiations with Canada were actually suspended after Canada implemented a digital services tax, which Washington didn't like. So the government in Canada actually suspended the implementation of that tax. I don't think it's been fully rescinded yet. And Chad can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But it has been suspended for the moment, and Washington reciprocated that by resuming the negotiations. Let's see, there was a successful conclusion of a deal between the United States and Vietnam. Although the deal, I don't have all of the details on it, but it's not likely to result in significant changes in the flow of trade between the United States and Vietnam. Vietnam agreed to lower tariffs on imports of American cars, but that doesn't mean anything because most everybody in Vietnam just drives scooters, motorcycles, that kind of thing. And I would point out too, like we talked about when we were talking about India a couple weeks ago, most of the most American producers now, that is to say, automotive producers, produce large SUVs of one kind, basically large vehicles. And those are exactly the kind of vehicle that people in Vietnam don't want because they don't really have the infrastructure for it. You know, a lot of the roads are relatively narrow. A lot of people can't afford large vehicles like that in any case. So this is probably going to be a superficial concession on the part of Hanoi. It'll please Washington, but it's not going to result in significant increases in exports or a trade or a significant change in the trade deficit the United States has with Vietnam. Vietnam also agreed to import more American natural gas, but I don't know how they're going to do that exactly, because their economy actually shifted away from natural gas consumption after their own natural gas reserves were depleted. And so they moved into things like coal or electric, whatnot. So at this point, they don't even necessarily have a lot of the infrastructure they used to have to even process natural gas. So that was another giveaway, another concession from Hanoi that didn't actually cost them anything. This isn't going to disrupt their energy market that much.
What things are natural gas used for aside from heat? Because that's usually what I think of it being used for.
Electricity. Actually, a lot of the electricity in Texas is generated from natural gas power plants. That was actually a big reason for the big freeze a couple years ago. You might remember it, where everybody lost power.
But you didn't.
Except me, I was lucky. But yeah, broad swaths of the state lost power for an extended period during a big freeze, right? The temperature plummeted. And a big reason for that was not so much because the windmills froze, as the government said, which was stupid. But also it wasn't necessarily because broad swaths of the energy sector were not winterized, which was the counter narrative that came up. Actually, it had to do with natural gas plants, and specifically, I think natural gas pipes froze over, and that prevented them from working. And because of that, natural gas power plants were cut off from their supply and couldn't produce enough electricity for everybody. And that resulted in a cascading failure. So electricity is definitely a big one. Heating, as you mentioned, is a big one. A byproduct of natural gas production is actually fertilizer, or more specifically, nitrogen, which is an ingredient used in fertilizer. I hope I'm getting that right. So that actually is it's not something natural gas itself is used for, but it's kind of ties natural gas to agriculture in a way that's not expected. So that's another indirect usage, you could say. Let's see, another thing Vietnam agreed to do, and this was a significant one, is they agreed to tax transshipments. So I mentioned before, a lot of Chinese goods re-export through other markets. Vietnam has been a big one in that regard. And Vietnam has agreed to clamp down on that by taxing those goods. I'm a little unclear on the details on that, like just what exactly they're going to do. Or how they're even going to implement it. Since Vietnam is a developing country, they don't necessarily have the administrative capacity to police that. So I suspect this might be another superficial concession on their part, where they agree to do something they either can't or won't end up doing later. So nominally, some wins for Washington here. They are technically getting some of what they want. But as I mentioned before, a lot of that may end up being Pyrrhic in nature. So let's see, that's Vietnam. And I would point out, too, that the Vietnam agreement could be a template for other such agreements. And I kind of said from the start, before Trump even took office, that a lot of his trade agreements in the past, and likely in the future, would end up being superficial agreements that didn't actually really change much. And early results are in and suggest that I'm probably right, or at least have been thus far. We'll see how future agreements pan out.
Well, one of the things that you've mentioned, and this doesn't apply just to Trump, but a lot of politicians do this, is if you can create a superficial agreement that falls through or follows through, then it looks really good to your base, like you're someone who's getting things done and convincing people and making deals. And the average consumer of news media is not going to be really looking into the details of how substantive is this change, how are these changes being held to account, that kind of thing. It's just kind of like, oh, they agreed to a deal, that must mean that we have a really good negotiator doing stuff for us.
Yeah, there's a lot of theater in modern American politics specifically because of that. It's kind of hard to take seriously. I don't even really follow it as closely as I used to just because of that, because I know 90% of what makes the news these days isn't really substantive. Most of the real action happening in the administration is kind of hidden from public view. I will point out that we could see more substantive trade policy now, although I'm dubious given the track record, but for much of the past 6 months since Trump took office, I guess it hasn't been that long, but Congress has been busy trying to negotiate a new budget bill, but they actually did finally pass it. I think it was last week or so. So what that means then is that Congress now has a lot more free time to do other stuff. And given Republican majorities, that other stuff could involve codifying some of the changes that Trump has been making over the past few months. So thus far, all of the changes the Trump administration has implemented, the vast majority of them anyway, have been implemented via executive order, either by dint of some existing legislative power that has sort of delegated some power to the executive, or by way of just direct executive order, regardless of whether they have the power to do that or not, to do a given thing or not. What that means in practice is that a lot of the stuff that he's done thus far could change very quickly, either with the new administration or even with a court ruling. You know, a new administration could undo everything he's done via executive order with new executive orders. And given that 90% of the stuff he's been doing has been by executive order, that means that a new government could just completely reverse all of these changes, could completely scrap all of the tariff agreements, like all of it could be gone very rapidly. A court order could do something similar. There was a court order not too long ago that said that that concluded that the Trump administration was abusing the tariff powers that had been delegated to it by Congress, and that a lot of the agreements that he's been making are effectively illegal, that he can't do them. But that ruling was kind of put on hold while it was appealed by the administration. If that ruling does end up holding, though, that itself could undo a lot of these agreements, since it would force the administration either to just scrap the whole thing or to find new excuses to do what they've already been doing, which I suspect is what they would end up doing, which would result in a new lawsuit, and then it would probably be 6 months to a year before you saw any kind of resolution to that. However, if Congress uses their new free time going forward to actually codify those changes in tariffs that he's negotiated, that changes things completely, because that means that all of the changes in the tariff rates would now then be illegal, which would give the administration significantly more leverage in its negotiations, since it would actually add some degree of certainty about whether or not these tariff agreements will actually stick over time. There's also other forms of things that Congress could do to kind of back up Trump here and reinforce his agenda, but I don't really know what's in the cards yet. I think they're on break right now because of July 4th. But once they get back, I'm sure they're going to have lots of interesting things that they'll be getting up to that no doubt will be making the news and that we will probably be talking about. So let's see. The European Union. So what's going on there? There's a debate within the European Union about whether to go hard and to try to kind of go tit for tat with Washington on the trade negotiations, or if it might be better to give some concessions in order to conclude the trade drama more quickly, in order to restore a degree of certainty and to kind of settle down the economy. Because Europe's economy has more pressures with inflation and not complete stagnation, but relatively less economic growth. And they've been getting squeezed in that regard for a while. So some parts of Europe would like to conclude the negotiation sooner rather than later, even if the final agreement is not fully equal in its terms. So Germany in particular has been pushing for that particular approach. France, in contrast, is the opposite. They're pushing hard for fully equal treatment. one example is that they want the U.S. to completely drop the baseline 10% tariff. They're very insistent on that. Germany doesn't give a shit. they're content with just facing that without retaliating if it means that they can get a final deal. Beyond that, Italy and Hungary, I've read, have been the countries in the EU that are the most favorable to Washington. They've even flirted at different times with bilateral deals with Washington, although that's almost certainly never going to actually happen. The European Union has been trying to increase its leverage by reaching out to Asia. They're considering a framework for a substitute for the World Trade Organization that would govern trade between Europe and Asia. The WTO at this point is kind of moribund because its resolution mechanics have been basically paralyzed by the United States. Washington has refused to allow new appellate judges to be appointed to the dispute resolution institution embedded in the WTO. And what that means is that the WTO's dispute resolution courts cannot operate. And so none of the disputes are being resolved. And so whether or not countries actually honor their agreements under the WTO not to discriminate and to maintain low tariffs, that is technically not being policed at all at the moment, for the most part. So Europe would like to try to create a new, different mechanism that will kind of fulfill the same role and restore more order to its trading relationship, at least with Asia, possibly with other partners if they actually get this off the ground. If they were able to do that, that would increase their leverage with Washington, because then they could basically just create a new trading regime that would exclude the United States, and that would be advantageous for Europe and by extension disadvantageous for the United States. Another point of leverage here for Europe that they already have is digital services taxes. The United States, because it has such dominant tech firms, is disproportionately vulnerable to taxes on those tech firms. And so Europe could threaten to retaliate against anything the United States does by disproportionately punishing those tech firms. A couple notes on industries within the European Union and how they've been talking about the trade negotiations. Obviously, the automotive industry rather, is a major political player in Europe, and they've said that they have mixed feelings about the trade negotiations. What I read is that premium car makers in Europe could probably handle a 10% baseline American tariff, so they don't necessarily care too much about that. However, car companies in Europe that are producing for low-income consumers in the United States, 10% baseline tariff would hurt them a lot more. It's not clear if they would be able to stay competitive because the profit margins on cheap cars are very narrow, as we've discussed before. And so any significant or even relatively marginal change in trading rules or tariffs or whatnot could put them in a difficult spot. The pharmaceutical industry in Europe is very large. It's a major exporter to the United States. It's one of the sources of Europe's trade surplus. They say that they don't want 10% US tariffs, but they would be willing to accept them if they can get concessions in other areas. So kind of a mixed message there as well. And I talked before about the beverage industry and how it kind of punches above its weight politically. The beverage industry in Europe doesn't care about the 10% baseline tariff in the United States. They just want a deal wrapped up as quickly as possible. They would prefer more stability than equitable treatment.
Are the beverages mainly like wines and alcohols and stuff, or?
Yeah, stuff like that.
Man, I can go into Italy and having wine there, France as well. The quality per cost of wine is so fucking good compared to getting the stuff imported. Yeah, like your basic table wine in Italy or France is pretty cheap because it doesn't really need to be transported very far and it's very high quality. It's like the bougie shit that you would get at a American restaurant, but it's hella cheap. I drank more red wine than I've ever had in Tuscany, Italy. It's very good. We would stay up late playing cards and getting drunk as fuck.
Sounds like you had a good time.
Yeah. They also have gelato, which is like the superior ice cream.
The superior ice cream.
Yep. Chat, anyone who's had gelato, would you agree or disagree? Gelato is ice cream, but done better.
Don't think I've ever had that.
There are some gelato places. Superior, yes, agree, consensus. There we go.
Is it better than Bluebell ice cream?
Yeah. Bluebell's not bad. Like, it's solid. It's decent stuff. But gelato is like, when I went to Italy and I had some, I was like, why do we not have this all the time? I don't understand. I still don't understand. We should have this. Someone dropped the ball.
Let's see. Okay, well, the last item I had here on the trade update has to do with China. And obviously, Sino-American trade negotiations have kind of been in their own little universe, separate from everybody else. And there's been a lot of developments. So I'll just try to get through them relatively quickly here. Let's see. So there had been some indirect retaliation from China, and we kind of learned more about it over time. So one of the ways that you can retaliate to another country tariffing your goods is raising your own tariffs, but another thing you can do is using things like non-tariff barriers to retaliate. And China, because it's an authoritarian one-party state, actually has more tools available to it vis-a-vis non-tariff barriers to trade than other countries do, than countries with other types of governments do anyway. Because the party can influence the decision-making of private companies without necessarily passing laws requiring them to change their behavior. And that gives them a degree of plausible deniability that would be unavailable to another type of government. You know, the United States government has to order companies not to do something or to do something if it wants them to do something or not do something. The Chinese government can refrain from doing that and just have the Communist Party and some of its representatives contact individual companies and lean on them, implicitly threaten them to behave in certain ways. And if anybody says that the Chinese government was doing that, they can say, hey, no, these companies just did it on their own. Nothing to do with us.
Oh, that's kind of similar to the strategy you told me about before, which is if they want to do something, get away with it, they will blame local government and keep the reputation of the national government better. Like we're here to help you against your local oppressors, when really it's kind of all part of a shared entity. You're just kind of creating a scapegoat.
Well, there is some truth to that. Local government in China is more autonomous than people think. It's inherently difficult to police an administrative state as large as China is. So invariably, there are a lot of loose cannons, a lot of corrupt local officials that just operate without any significant guidance from the national government. But yes, the national government does kind of free ride on that fact. You know, they kind of lean on the fact that the local government is less accountable and relatively more corrupt than the national government to try to preserve the public's faith in the national level government. And, you know, this is kind of similar in that they're trying to kind of pass off blame, but it's also different in that it actually is the national government actively influencing the decision-making of firms. You know, so in the former case, with regard to avoiding blame for corruption, you know, they're trying to be indirect. You know, they're trying to kind of get people to focus on, they're trying to direct public attention to lower level officials. With trade here, they're actually using the Communist Party and its great breadth, because, you know, party officials are everywhere, party members are everywhere, and they can contact people unofficially, you know, because it is a political party, not a government, even though in China it's kind of both. But they can send their officials to contact people and implicitly threaten them. And they do that at the behest of the central government. So that is a strategy that they do. You know, they can cut foreign companies off from like a critical resource. And rather than having the government say, you know, we wanted to do this, we want them to stop doing that, we passed a law requiring them to cut off sales to, you know, this particular company or this particular country. They can just say, hey, that's just the free market, that our particular firm selling that particular good doesn't want to sell to you for free market reasons. It's nothing to do with the party or with the government. So you should just accept it. And then if another country gives the party something that it wants, then magically the company changes its mind. And meanwhile, the government of China will still deny it's culpable, in any of that. They've done that plenty of times, and it's one of the advantages, again, that they have over the United States in trade negotiations. But anyway, one of the things that they did is they leaned on Chinese airlines to stop taking orders from Boeing. A lot of aircraft that Chinese airlines use is from Boeing, and so the government here wanted to pressure the United States by trying to get Chinese airlines to shift suppliers away from Boeing. Another thing they did pretty early on is a new licensing regime for rare earth materials, as well as refined rare earth materials. It wasn't entirely clear early on if they would actually use that licensing regime to cut off foreign firms. They've implemented licensing regimes in the past, but then basically just gave everybody who applied a license. But this time, they actually did disrupt the supply to foreign firms. That is to say, they actually rejected a lot of applications for these licenses. And the result is that not only American producers, but pretty much producers around the world found their supply of rare earth materials severely disruptive. So they actually pulled the trigger this time. They actually hit the big red button and actually cut off the world from a good chunk of its rare earth supply. So that kind of roiled markets for the past couple months until a lot of those supplies were resumed. We'll kind of get into that. But that was one of the indirect forms of retaliation that was implemented, curtailing the export of rare earths. Now, at the same time that they were doing that, they were under a lot of pressure from American tariffs. And so while they were willing to kind of tolerate that so that they didn't lose face and seemed to be caving under pressure, there were certain industries in China that were under severe pressure from American tariffs. And so the Chinese government, well, I should say here, not severe pressure, not from American tariffs so much as Chinese tariffs on certain American goods, because obviously the Chinese had retaliated against the American tariff hikes. So the Chinese government gave exemptions to certain industries and firms that were under the most pressure. So those included certain pharmaceutical goods, not all pharmaceutical goods, but very specific ones from what I've read. Certain types of microchips and analog chips, certain types of plane parts, including engines and landing gear, and ethene as well got exemptions. Apparently the US is like the world's dominant supplier of ethene, which surprised me. If you don't know what ethene is, that's a core material used to make plastic. Polyethylene, for example, is, I think, the most prominent form of plastic produced. Ethene is the core, I think, the core ingredient in that. And then medical supplies also got an exemption, but that's not surprising. That's obviously more humanitarian reasons than strategic reasons. It's worth noting here that the United States government kind of signaled early on, not early on, but sort of a couple months into the trading conflict with China, that the ultra-high tariffs that had been set were unsustainable and that they wanted some kind of de-escalation. And the fact that the Chinese government was giving these exemptions was kind of tacit admission on their part that that was true, and that there should be some kind of negotiation to reduce the pressure. So that eventually led to new negotiations in Geneva, Switzerland. I'll kind of spare you the lead up to the negotiations, but eventually they did agree to hold the talks, and both parties agreed to reduce their recent tariffs to 30%. Pre-existing tariffs remained in place, so the U.S. fentanyl tariff on China, as well as the tariffs that had been implemented in Trump's first term back in the day, those also remained in place. But the recent hikes that had taken tariffs up to like over 100%, those would all be reduced down to just 30%. So significant de-escalation there. The U.S., for its part, also afterwards reduced the de minimis tariff to 30%. This is the tariff on parcels, that is to say packages mailed into the United States, which previously had been exempt if it was valued under a certain amount. The Trump administration hiked the rate on those if they came from China. After the Geneva Agreement, they reduced the rate that was charged for those packages to 30%, presumably in line with the overall tariff reduction that was agreed at Geneva. China, for its part, agreed to end restrictions on the sale of rare earths to U.S. companies. Also, the agreement has a 90-day sunset provision, meaning that it would end around July, roughly speaking. I'm sure we'll be getting to that soon, too. So in the aftermath of Geneva, markets were pretty excited. This seemed to kind of settle some of the pending doom that had settled into markets. However, the agreement didn't really last very long, because what happened shortly after the agreement was agreed is that the United States announced some new export restrictions on China involving advanced technology like microchips, AI chips, etc. Now, Beijing said that this broke the spirit of the agreement, and they in turn imposed some new export restrictions on rare earths. The United States didn't like that, so the Trump administration retaliated by implementing some new export restrictions of their own, in this case on jet engine exports to Chinese state-owned aerospace manufacturer Comac, which is the leading passenger plane company in China. Also, they put new export restrictions on certain design softwares, more export restrictions on ethene, and export restrictions on nuclear equipment, which is a leading American export item. So all of this kind of set them back pretty significantly. Tariffs remained at the new agreed lower level, but export restrictions obviously spinning out of control there. This all happened in June, by the way. I would point out that some of the things the US government did that initiated this tit for tat beyond export restrictions on computer chips of one kind or another also involved canceling visas for Chinese students and warning companies against using chips made by Huawei, a leading Chinese tech firm. So this tit for tat seemed to be spinning out, and so both parties agreed to hold new talks in London. And in these talks, a new agreement was reached that resolved some of the outstanding issues. China agreed to release rare earths. The US agreed to ease some of the recently imposed export restrictions. The specific details of the London agreement are unclear. Probably a lot of that was just done in private, handshake agreement type stuff. China, however, did decide that they would continue to restrict exports of rare earths that were used for military applications. So rare earth materials used for commercial purposes like automotive, whatnot, restrictions on those would be eased, but military applicable rare earths would continue to be restricted. And they conditioned easing of those restrictions on the United States relaxing its restrictions on the export of AI chips. Now, there was still some disputes about some of the details, the technical specifics of the export restrictions that had been agreed in London. And so in late June, there was some kind of new agreement reached. There was very little reporting on this, so it kind of flew under the radar, but there was some kind of mini agreement reached in late June regarding the technical details of implementing the Geneva Agreement. At least that's how it was framed in Washington. And the agreement, from what we know about it, involves the following. China will approve export applications of certain controlled items. The Chinese government didn't mention rare earths, but it could include them. It's notable here that 3 US automakers got approvals for magnets from China shortly after this. So this may have been a big part of the negotiation here. There may have been an impetus to try to help out large American automakers. The US, for its part, just agreed not to impede the admittance of Chinese students, since that had gotten to be an issue by that point. I imagine there's other things the US agreed to do there, as well as probably China. But again, these are basically secret agreements, and we really don't know all of the details.
There was a question from chat. Is China still considered a third world country by the World Trade Organization so that China gets reduced rates for trade?
It is still considered a developing country, but it is not considered by the WTO to be a developing country, specifically so that China could continue to gain privileges. It is still considered a developing country because it is still a developing country. It does not have an economy on par with the West. Its economy is very large, but its GDP per capita is still fairly low. I think it's still comparable to like Mexico, for example, in those terms. There are definitely parts of China that are quite developed. Shanghai, Beijing, generally the coastal regions of China are pretty far along, but those are not representative of all of China. The further inland into China you go, generally the more backwards it gets. There are some exceptions, places like Wuhan or Chengdu, maybe Chongqing. Some of the bigger cities like that in the interior are relatively better off, but there are still broad swaths of China that are relatively rural and relatively undeveloped and have a long way to go. So even if China has come a long way, it's still got a long way to go before it's really on par with the West as a developed economy.
Gotcha.
Let's see, so that agreement in late June was the last big item I had for China and the United States. China did make a play to improve its leverage by appealing to Europe to perhaps create some kind of united front. After the Geneva deal seemed on the verge of collapse, they actually made an offer to Europe to accelerate the examination and approval of rare earth exports to European firms. They also offered to deliver a verdict on its trade investigation of EU brandy imports by July 5th, basically expediting the investigation so that it could conclude earlier and allow unfettered access to Chinese markets earlier. Nothing came of that offer. The Europeans did not reciprocate it, partly because Europe has its own issues with trade with China. For example, the European Union imposed anti-dumping duties on imports of Chinese electric vehicles, and China retaliated to that with higher tariffs on European brandy, as I recall. So there's tension in that trading relationship already. It does make some sense to negotiate together as a united front against the United States, but Europe, even so, prefers to negotiate on its own so that it can basically not have to give concessions to China in its own in the Sino-European trading relationship. So that actually benefits the United States in so much as they're not able to make that happen. Okay, so that's all I had for trade. So some movement, some developments, but at the same time, we're not really in that different a place than we were in before. Markets are still uncertain about the reciprocal tariff negotiations. Nobody knows how that ends exactly. There is a growing sense in markets that Trump always backs down when the trading negotiations get too heated, hence the Taco Dawn thing. So it could be that markets get comfortable enough with the trade turbulence that effectively they just start ignoring it. In which case, there could be significant drama later if the Trump administration actually follows through with its threats. But it also means that things could just settle down if they continue to actually avoid the abyss of an actual dramatic change in trade policy. So that could even out markets and result in the economy kind of stabilizing. It all just kind of depends on what the administration wants to do. And I would point out that they've still got about 3.5 years to go for whatever drama they want to get into. So it's a long time to wait. But hopefully things do calm down. We shall see.
There's still time.
Well, was there anything else in particular you wanted to get to?
I was randomly thinking as you were going, has there been any update on the Myanmar drama?
Not really. There was a rebel offensive targeting a town on the border near the border with China. It's an area that produces a lot of rare earths. China, for the most part, mines most of its own rare earths, but they also import a good chunk of their rare earths from Burma. And this particular area near the border is a particular hotspot. The government has controlled it, but rebels have been pressuring the government there. The Chinese government would like them to stop, has pressured them to stop, but the rebels have basically ignored them. And the rebel attitude is that once they seize it, then the Chinese will basically just do business with them, regardless of the impact on the Burmese government that they've been supporting prior. So they've been making progress there. They haven't taken the area yet, but they're getting closer. I don't have any other updates, though. The situation is still pretty fluid. For the most part, rebels continue to make incremental gains on the periphery of Burma, generally near the border, but they remain relatively disorganized. And penetration into the core of Burma, where most of the population lives, and where the military has the core of its support, still not that deep. So the rebels still have a long way to go. But at the same time, the government hasn't really been making a lot of advances. They seem to be slowly but steadily losing ground over time.
So no deep penetration in the rear. Gotcha.
Always.
Speaking of which, how's Djibouti?
As far as I know, it's doing all right. I haven't really heard a lot out of East Africa recently. You know what I did hear today? I got to learn it the hard way. BBC News is now going to charge a subscription fee to read its articles for users in the United States specifically. Yeah, so that's not going to be freely available anymore.
Damn, do you know what the subscription cost is? Because I think that's one of the ones you use more often than some others.
It's going to be like £9 a year, but I don't really want to pay that. I already pay a decent amount for other subscriptions. It's not like I have a lot of money to work with in the first place. I think I'm subscribed to the Diplomat and Foreign Affairs. Those are my main ones. I also got a subscription to Foreign Policy recently because I managed to get a discount on it, but I don't know if I'll be able to get that same discount in future, so that could end up being a temporary thing. But yeah, BBC is going to charge me. Specifically me. It's only for the United States. I don't think it's going to work out for them. Al Jazeera tried to do that way back when, during the Arab Spring. Right, when the Arab Spring happened, there was a big flood of traffic into Al Jazeera, specifically their English service. And it looked like they might become a player. But then the company decided that the thing to do was to start up a TV channel in the United States and then to block access to its website to force people to use their new American website, which was specifically for their TV channel, which didn't have nearly as much in terms of news coverage as their website did. So the result is that they completely lost all of the traffic that they gained. And they stuck with it for a long time, too. I think it was like 5 to 10 years that they continued to block access to their website for users in the US. So the US users would use their Al Jazeera America website, which nobody wanted to do, and it didn't happen. And eventually they just had to scrap the whole thing. It was just an utter failure. So it seems like something similar will probably happen here. You know, if they do want to paywall their stuff, probably they're going to lose a lot more than they gain in terms of viewers. Probably make a little bit of money, though, which I think is the point. I have read that BBC is kind of hurting for cash these days. A lot of their funding comes from a TV license tax. In the UK, you have to pay a tax for owning a TV, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a weird, archaic tax. Like something from the 17th century. Well, fewer and fewer people have TVs. A lot of people just watch stuff online now, so that's been a problem for them. But still, I resent it.
Yeah.
And I already pay money for, sorry, what?
You feel personally attacked.
Always, when I have to pay for stuff that's been free. Even if it makes sense to charge for it, still. I don't like my routine being disrupted, Neuro.
I hear that.
Well, I already pay for a VPN, and that's, well, that seems to work, shall we say. So I'm not overly concerned about it. But still, I resent the inconvenience. All the more so because, again, I don't think it's going to last. I don't think this is really going to generate a whole lot of revenue for them. But we'll see. Maybe I'm wrong. Actually, there's been a lot of traction on paywalling stuff in Europe recently. Because Texas and some other states in the US, they had some new laws regarding access to erotic material, right? Like certain websites. Well, Europe is actually doing something similar now. And so a lot of their websites that have been freely available in states like Texas, now they're getting blocked too because of European rules.
Huh.
Yeah. Yeah, that Wild West period of the internet seems to be closing more and more.
The boob tax.
Yeah. Yeah, it's regrettable, but probably inevitable. Paywalls everywhere, Neuro, where it used to be free range.
They're taking on money. Giving us the same great value for higher prices.
I'm old enough to remember when the phrase "information wants to be free" was the refrain of the internet. Seems less so now. I guess that's just part of getting old.
People want their bread.
Yeah, I just wish they didn't want my bread. I don't have any.
This is not the bread you're looking for.
Well, there's been more violence in Palestine and Israel, but it's not anything new. It's basically just the same violence.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not really any updating there. There was some talk about a new deal that the Hamas might agree to, and then the Israelis said no, and then there was some back and forth, and then it came to nothing, which is the usual pattern with peace talks like that. Happens so often I don't even really pay attention to it anymore. There's been a little bit of stuff happening in Ukraine, but not a whole lot. There's been a significant uptick in the tempo of Russian bombardments of Ukrainian cities. They've been attacking more frequently and harder with their drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. Because they generally attack cities in volleys, right? They'll have a big volley attacking one city, and then maybe a month later they'll do it again with a different city. Mm-hmm. But for the past month or so, they've been going particularly hard. And they've been targeting Kiev, I think, specifically, for the most part. It's been really draining the Ukrainians' air defense munitions, which was a problem because the Trump administration cut them off from new military aid for about a week. And then they just resumed it a week later for reasons that are not entirely clear. I think I read an article suggesting that the Secretary of Defense did that on his own initiative, apparently with the logic that America's own stores of munitions are running low and that we can't afford to keep sending them to Ukraine. But I guess that's not true because, again, they resumed those transfers. Although the resumption in transfers is happening kind of vicariously. It's they're not giving away stuff. The Europeans, that is to say, European allies and NATO, supposedly are buying munitions. I think specifically Patriot missile systems and missiles are going to be bought by European actors and then turned over to Ukraine. I think that was the deal that was reached in order to end the moratorium on new aid. But I don't know if that extends to all kinds of munitions, like, say, artillery shells and whatnot, or if that was specific to the Patriot system. That was a little ambiguous. It's not even entirely clear that the disruption was like a negotiating tactic. Like, I don't know if... Well, I don't know that Hegseth suspended aid purely for the reasons he said he did, like because stores were being depleted. Like, it could be it was actually a negotiating tactic just to pressure Europe and Ukraine. But without more details on the agreement that was reached, I can't really tell what they were trying to do or if they were successful. So that's kind of been the drama in Ukraine for the past couple weeks. But overall, aid seems to have been resumed, so the status quo ante seems to have resumed. I don't know for how long, but for the moment, it seems things are back to normal. You never really know for sure with the Trump administration.
Yep.
What else did you want to get to?
Well, if it's been super slow, we don't have to do tons of stuff. Chat, was there any country you would like to give a little update about?
Notice we did have some questions. We can try doing those.
Yeah, that works.
What's going on in Pakistan and the refusal to adopt Western practices? I'm not sure what you mean. What specific Western practices are we talking about? Yeah, the answer is going to be very much contingent on that. Because they've actually got more or less a Western form of government already. You could talk about culture, why don't they modernize? But the answer there is obvious. It's a developing country. Developing countries almost always invariably have fairly conservative cultures overall, just by dint of still being relatively rural. Yeah, so I would need some elaboration there. What specific Western practices they're not adopting. Gen Z seems to have a lot of antipathy towards capitalism. Considering most people cannot define capitalism, it seems like a catch-all label given to stuff I don't like. How do you read the shift in public opinion? Is there anything substantive there? I don't really think there is anything substantive there, because for probably 50 years, maybe 100 years, young people in general have been pretty hostile to capitalism. That's not really new. Generally people find it harder to make their way, make enough money to cover their costs when they're younger and not making as much money. But statistically speaking, as you get older, you are likely to start making more money, assuming that you're working and, putting in the work and whatnot, which most people do. So while people struggle when they're young and complain about capitalism, as they get older and make more money, they get more comfortable and they complain relatively less. or maybe some cases even just convert fully into pro-capitalism.
I definitely represent this on a personal level. I don't know if you remember the Occupy movement, but I was out there for the Occupy Dallas protests, and there's a lot of passion for the youth, and I think that's a good energy to challenge the system. But the whole young people saying fuck the system, that's like a thousands-year-old thing. That might just be a primal human urge to test the boundaries of the system that's in place. And any system that you grow up in is inherently flawed. So for you to speak out against the flaws in the system with fresh eyes is totally valid, and that makes sense. But when you kind of rail against the system and you go to those protests and you realize how disorganized a lot of people's passion and their different claims and things they're asking for are, you feel like, okay, well, maybe we do need some system and we can't just go full anarchy. And then you see the system that you're looking at and you're like, okay, it's flawed, but what we have in the US is better than a lot of other places. So you tend to simmer down a little bit and kind of see the merits of capitalistic elements in society, at least for me, compared to other different kinds of things with more command and control. So yeah, I had that phase, and I definitely feel like what I was arguing for, I would still completely agree with. Like Citizens United and Glass-Steagall were the two key policies that I wanted to push discussion on, but most people who were going there were just yelling, "We are the 99%," and you're chanting something that isn't going to lead into any change. You're just stating a statistic of we have less money than the top 1%. So you get a large group of people very fired up, but unless you have specific ways that would be changed with the levers of the system, you're just yelling on the street. That's basically what it is. So protesting is cool. I respect it. It can be done very well. But contrasting it with like the Hong Kong protests, you need a lot of cooperation with professionals and elites and people who are in the system who can help you make that change into some kind of action. Because if it doesn't lead into a plan where you have a unified front on a specific thing, then your energy is more like a mist rather than like it needs to be a surgical strike of this is the problem, this is what we want to change, and we all agree on this particular thing. There was a dude who was out there who was talking about fluoride in the water, and a bunch of people were agreeing with him about that, but that wasn't what the Occupy movement was about. But it kind of shows you that people who are trying to resist the system, that's fine, but if you're not pointed about what you want changed, then nothing is going to change. You're just yelling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was not sufficiently organized to operationalize its political support into actual political gains.
Yeah. But to my previous point, Gen Z isn't the first generation, and you said this too. They're not the first generation to rally against the system. You could even say a lot of the free love movement and stuff in the 60s, the hippies and so on, were the same kind of energy of young people who feel like there's too much government, there's too much control, there's too much coldness in society, and we need to value people more. But that's a pretty nebulous concept. But the energy of that is always there. And we do need that. Like, we need a value placed upon compassion. And if you're discontent, then you need to tell people so you can try to motivate change. Not everyone is going to be politically savvy enough to push those changes through. So even if you're not a political expert, your opinion is valid. Just know that opinions are dime a dozen. And if you want something changed, then doing research and trying to get some traction with people who actually know what they're doing with politics is going to be a good angle.
I don't want to take away from the fact that there is genuine ideology there. Like, in general, younger people tend to be more critical of capitalism and to be attracted to left economic ideas. And that does kind of generally change over time, but there are people that are consistent over time as well. There are people that are genuinely just committed to that perspective. But that's a relatively fixed percentage. I don't think it changes all that much over time. I would need some data to show otherwise to convince me. Let's see. In regards to China, and it'd still be considered a developing country, they are the second largest economy in the world based on GDP. What is the reason it keeps developing country status? Is that based on the overall area of the country, still developing, or something else? Thank you. Whether or not a country is developed doesn't have to do with the overall size of the economy. That's pretty much irrelevant. Having a developed economy refers to things like A-grade infrastructure, A-grade manufacturing industries, A-grade, a variety of like top-notch industries. Generally the upper echelon of those industries, and generally very specific parts of the process that are considered high-end. In manufacturing, you have design, and then you have the actual manufacturing, and then you have assembly. So if all you have is assembly, then you're not really fully developed, right? Generally developed countries are at the point where assembly and manufacturing can't really be done on a competitive basis, and so they generally just monopolize the design side. So the upper sort of fancy part of the manufacturing process actually still largely resides in the West, in the United States, Japan, and Europe. China is catching up in that regard, relatively quickly, but they're still not really there yet fully. And the premium side of the market is still, especially, something that they haven't penetrated much. If you want like the highest level of automotive goods, or even just generic goods of one kind or another, generally that means you'll be buying European, Japanese, or American, for the most part. If you're buying cheap, obviously China's competitive there. Mid-tier, China is pretty competitive there, more so over time. But it's not fully developed like, again, Europe, Japan, the United States. It hasn't caught up in terms of the sophistication of its manufacturing sector. Developing countries also, I should say developing economies and developing countries, are generally also defined by the quality of rule of law. That's kind of a soft part of the definition, but if you don't have it, then that's seen as something that reflects institutional weakness in your government, and that generally has an effect on your economy that is negative. China's economy has grown very large in spite of that effect, in spite of the fact that it doesn't really have rule of law, but it's reaching a point of diminishing returns. if it really wants to push its economy to the next gear and actually make a real play to achieve actual developed status, then it's going to have to develop rule of law. There's basically no way that it can happen otherwise. As I said before, there are pockets of China that are fairly developed, that are comparable to what you could see in places like, the United States, Japan, or Europe. But that's not likely to extend into other parts of the country. Keep in mind, New Zealand, for example, has an economy that is disproportionately agricultural, although most of the population is urban. But even though its economy is disproportionately agricultural in terms of its output and orientation, it's still developed. Like if you're a rural citizen in New Zealand, you live really well. And if you compare how, say, a farmer in New Zealand, or the United States for that matter, to how a farmer in China lives, it's night and day. Like it's radically different. Economic development in China has been mostly focused in urban areas. It hasn't spilled out into rural areas. And even in tier 3 or tier 2 cities in China, development isn't as great as it is in the tier 1 cities. So there is a sliding scale, and it differs by region, how developed different parts of China are. And again, the GDP per capita is much, much lower in China. I think it's around like $13,000. So yes, the overall size of China is very large, but the average individual citizen is only making about $13,000 a year. Now that's an average. A median would be a better statistic, and even the median is going to change pretty dramatically depending on province or city or county or what have you. But in general, to compare, GDP per capita in the United States is like $60,000. So it's about 5 times what it is in China. So on average, that is to say, the average American makes much more money than the average Chinese does. And the quality of life in the United States is correspondingly higher. In so much as there are people in China who live well, they disproportionately have some of the relatively few well-paying jobs. And when I say well-paying, I mean like by international standards. They disproportionately live in cities, generally tier 1 cities like Beijing, Chongqing, Chengde. I guess Chengde is not really a tier 1 city. Beijing, Chongqing, Shanghai, and I think Shenzhen is the other tier 1. And also, they benefit disproportionately by the fact that so many people in China make so little money. So much of the economy is manufacturing or low-wage services. And because so many people compete for those jobs, wages are very low. Now, that's bad for most of the country. It makes it hard to live there. But if you are one of the people living well in, say, Beijing or Shanghai, that means the cost of living is very low. I read a travelogue from a guy, I think he was a Chinese guy, but I think he might have been like Chinese-American or something. He wrote in English anyway, and he talked about how China is a traveler's utopia because everything is so cheap. And that's technically true, but it's also kind of a bad thing in a broader sense, because that kind of betrays how weak the economy is, that wages are relatively depressed in China right now, such that you can get so much stuff for cheap. So again, just to kind of summarize, having a large economy does not mean you're a developed country. The things that define a developed country include really high-level manufacturing, generally, especially the design and research and development side of it. Rule of law, high-quality infrastructure. China does have high-quality infrastructure, but it's not quite as ubiquitous as, say, the United States. For example, China has really great rail networks, pretty good roads. They've been constructing a whole bunch over the past 20 years. More concrete is laid in China every year than was laid in the United States over the course of the entire 20th century. Wild statistic.
Wow.
So in terms of hard infrastructure like that, yeah, they have a lot. But keep in mind, in China, you can't drink the water out of the tap. When I was there, that was a problem, and as far as I know, it still is today. One of the private sector industries in China that manages to succeed on its own merits without government subsidies, and you'd be surprised how relatively few those kinds of companies are in China. One of them is the water bottle companies, because so many people depend on bottled water for what they drink, because they can't drink out of the tap. If they do drink out of the tap, they have to boil it first. So soft infrastructure like that, things like water sanitation, broader sanitation systems. Stuff like that is not as ubiquitous as it is in the United States. And keep in mind, a lot of the stuff that's normal in the United States, the stuff what we take for granted, is very much not normal in China. I was actually doing a review of all of the machinery that I have just in my own household that would be considered, fancy in a lot of developing countries. So, for example, stove, right? Stove, microwave, refrigerator, air conditioning unit, washer, dryer, water heater. We've got a central vacuum system. That's a lot of machinery for one house by international standards. It's not that unusual for an American house, especially in Texas where I live. But it's quite a bit by Chinese standards. You will find a house or an apartment, more likely, that has all of those amenities in it to be very rare. Actually, even in Japan, it's pretty rare to have dryers. Washers are relatively more common, but dryers are pretty rare. A lot of people in Japan still just dry their clothes the old-fashioned way, putting them outside on clotheslines. Oh, dishwasher. I forgot about the dishwasher. I hate the dishwasher. That's why I forgot it.
Why do you hate the dishwasher?
We do have one. I was raised to wash the dishes, to rinse the dishes, I guess I should say, before I put them in the dishwasher, which kind of defeats the purpose of the dishwasher to me, but I don't know. That's how I was trained as a child. So for me, the dishwasher feels a little bit redundant.
Gotcha.
But that's just me. Personal opinion. Also, they tend to be very wasteful of water. That's a more objective reason to hate them.
Excuse me.
But yeah, China, in terms of like standard of living and quality of life, for the average Chinese person, they've still not caught up to the West. Hence, they're still technically a developing country, among the other reasons that I mentioned. How are we doing on time?
Good. It's been about 2 hours. We can go as long as you want to. I know it's been a slower week. And I am down to Baldur's Gate later, whenever we're concluding.
Okay. If nobody else has anything they want to ask or kind of touch on, then we might just wrap up.
Works for me. I'm in a match, so maybe Phil for a
All right.
few minutes.
Pick a region.
All right. Let's do North Africa.
North Africa. Okay. And it's a rough place these days.
Why?
So Egypt became a totalitarian state after, well, not after the Arab Spring, but after the Egyptian military seized power from the Muslim Brotherhood government that won election after the Arab Spring. And they became even more authoritarian than they were under Mubarak. Libya still basically doesn't have a unified government of any kind. There's two separate governments. Excuse me. There's two separate governments in Libya competing for power. One of them in Tripoli, the other one in, I want to say, Benghazi, was it? I forget it. I forget what the other city was. But basically, the Tripoli government has the western part of the country for the most part, and then the eastern government, the Benghazi government, has the eastern part of the country. Let's see. Tunisia remains a sad story. You know, after the Arab Spring, they had pretty much the only successful democratic transition. So they had a democratic government for about 10 years, but then they had a guy who claimed to be a reformist. There was a presidential election like 5 years ago or so, and it kind of came, the democratic government was getting increasingly popular, so there was a populist candidate for president who was saying he was going to fix all of the problems, and a lot of people, especially outside observers, were concerned that maybe democratic gains in Tunisia would be lost if the populist won. And so a reformist candidate running against him actually defeated the populist, and everybody was pretty content with that. But then the reformist turned out to be an authoritarian who seized power. Whoops. So much for that. So yeah, Tunisia doesn't have a democratic government anymore. So even that experiment has failed now. Doesn't mean that democracy in North Africa or Tunisia has failed forever, but it does mean that this particular iteration has not succeeded, and they're going to have to try again later. Let's see, and then Morocco. No, Algeria technically is west of Tunisia. Yeah, Algeria still is under the thumb of de facto one-party rule. It's the same party that led the revolution against France when they were fighting for their independence back in the 50s. And, they said they wanted to liberate the country, but instead they just kind of traded one master for the other. There was a nominal transition of power. The previous president, Bouteflika, finally was pushed out of power, but that basically just replaced one faction within the party with another. So there hasn't been any actual substantive change that came out of that. I haven't really heard as much about excuse me. I haven't heard as much about Algeria over the past 5 years. They've done a pretty good job staying out of the news. I think the only substantive thing I can recall is that a good chunk of Europe Europe got a good chunk of its natural gas imports from Algeria. And so after the war in Ukraine started back in 2022, there was a renewal in interest in burdening and bolstering the relationship with Algeria to secure energy supplies. Let's see, and then there was Morocco. Morocco doesn't get hardly any attention in international news, which is a credit to them because it kind of reflects how relatively well behaved they are. There's not like big revolutions, not a lot of political violence, but neither is there significant poverty. It's still a developing country. They've definitely got poverty, but it's not quite as pronounced in some of the other states in the region that are struggling economically. So compared to the regional average, Morocco does pretty well for itself. But the downside is that I just have no idea what's going on. They don't make the news hardly ever, so I never really know what's going on there at any given time.
I've heard they have really good food. It's a fairly common tourist destination for Europeans, especially French, because it's not too far away and it's cheap, I think, to visit. But I have not been to Morocco. My parents are in Greece right now, so that's a cool trip for them. Very deep history there.
Yeah, they'll appreciate the money. They definitely need it. They checking out Athens and whatnot?
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
Yeah, they're there for, I think, a week and a half, so they should get a good bit of tourism. Is their economy still kind of poopy-doopy?
Greece?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for the most part. It's recovered significantly since the Eurozone crisis, so it's doing much better, but that's not saying much. It's not doing great. It's just doing okay. But that still leaves much to be desired, and there's still been a significant outflow of population. There's been a lot of emigration to greener pastures. It's probably been one of the main ways that the people there have coped with it. Well, I'm sure your parents will have some good stories once they get back.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly they'll enjoy the food. Greek food is pretty good. Strong recommend.
Yeah, I've heard as much. They, I think, are the ones who made the Hero, which is a really good mixture of flavors. I had a Hero pizza this past week that was amazingly good. Basically all the ingredients you'd expect in a Hero, but done as a pizza. One final question here from Dagnip. How important is the opinion/reports of Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, and such for countries?
In terms of what? Like, are we talking in terms of government debt or in terms of just private sector investment?
Don't know. Maybe both?
Well, I don't know that Wells Fargo, J.P. Morgan really do a lot of government debt stuff. I'm sure they invest a lot in government debt of one kind or another, but I don't know that they're like big players in that. Those are basically uh, more relevant to private equity, investments from that. So I would imagine in terms of like gauging how attractive a given country's economy is for private sector investment, for something like that, the opinions of those firms would probably be more relevant. But I think there's other bigger movers and shakers in bond markets that would be more relevant there.
Cool. There was a follow-up from chat on my comparison of French people going on tourist trips to Morocco. They said France and Morocco have especially warm relations. Most Moroccans dream to emigrate to France.
Really?
Yeah. So I guess the countries like each other.
I've heard of Algerians going to France because they have a linguistic link. There's still a lot of Algerians that speak French.
Mm-hmm.
And France imported a whole bunch of Algerian workers to work in factories back in the 1950s, 60s, I think it was. Mm-hmm. So they have a pretty large minority of Algerians there. But I haven't heard about Moroccans going to France so much. I've heard about Moroccans in the Netherlands. I think the Netherlands has a pretty sizable minority there. Mm-hmm. But this is the first time I'd heard Moroccans really wanted to go to France. It was part of the French Empire for a while, so maybe I shouldn't be surprised. But it was kind of a weird arrangement. It wasn't like full-on colonial control. It was kind of this weird condominium where Morocco was split into thirds. And the northern two-thirds were overseen by France, and the bottom one-third was overseen by Spain. And I think nominally, Morocco still had its own government, but it was just heavily overseen and interfered with by French authorities.
Did not know that. Yeah, France is a really nice country to visit. It's definitely socialist leaning in terms of its political alignment. So for an American, a lot of conservatives would grouch about their policies and so on. But the food is amazing. The architecture is amazing. The fashion is amazing. The drivers are actually really good compared to American drivers just because their roads are more slender and more hazardous. So if you're a bad French driver, you probably already died. They're just like the bridges and stuff that you go over. There'll be like a stone barrier that's maybe half a foot high, and that's all that's between you and a chasm. So in the U.S., most states, you have super wide roads that are made for big trucks, whereas European cars are a lot more compact on average. Even the SUVs are a little bit closer to like a Honda CR-V normally. You don't see those big Texas trucks and stuff on the road, so good driving. There is a strong national identity for the French that has quite a bit of attitude. And if you go to their country and you speak English at them, they will oftentimes have a bad reaction to that. So my advice for touring in France is to try French first, at least for a sentence, and then they'll think that you're cute for trying, and then they'll speak English to you. So
they will take pity upon you.
Yes, because then they get to feel smart. But if you go to them speaking English first, you come across as entitled. And they don't like that because they like their French pride. It's their country, their language. You should at least try when you're in their land. So I respect that. But yeah, France is not Paris. Paris is kind of like asshole city, like any huge urban area. New York, same thing. If you go to France and you go to Paris, people are grumpy. People are in a hurry. People don't want you in their space. And it's very sour. So if you only go to Paris, French people will seem very mean. But if you go somewhere like Nice, or you go in the Provence region or something, super nice, very warm sort of culture where they're very relaxed. They have a 3-hour lunch. They just want to chat and be lazy. It's great. I like it.
I have a very positive impression of France and French culture.
Yeah. Well, my family lived in Nice for 2 years, so I got to go there for all my summer and winter breaks.
Oh, nice.
That was very pleasant. Very
Well,
few downsides.
if you ever want to start an argument, if you ever want to start shit with chat, just assert that French culture is superior to Anglo culture.
Ooh.
That'll get an argument going for sure.
Yeah, but if you say French food is better than British food, everyone will nod.
Yeah, that's not really in dispute.
Yeah. And we have at least arrived at a consensus in chat, which anytime you get a consensus, that's a big victory. Gelato is superior to ice cream. There were
no, to try some.
There were no dissenting opinions. There were some people, there was one person who said that Blue Bell is almost as good as gelato. So that was a little bit of a caveat, but still on track. But definitely try some gelato if you can find some. I know there's at least one brand that has a few shops that were open in the Dallas-Fort Worth area when I was there. I can't remember the name of it, but they have it in like malls and stuff sometimes.
Do we have any malls left down here?
North Park and the Galleria are never going to go away. So
yeah,
if you happen to
sure.
go to one of those.
Actually, yeah, if anybody would have it, it would be them, given their clientele.
Yeah. Did Agent Smith finish up his World War II history breakdown? Yes, for the Eastern Front. There's basically always more to talk about with World War II. We've done the Pacific Theater, and we've done the Eastern Front. You can go to the YouTube channel. There's a World Discussion playlist, and those are labeled, I think it's 1 through 5, so it's 5 parts.
Yeah, that was a very messy review. It wasn't as organized as the Pacific Theater review. I kind of just wanted to do it to get it out of the way, since I knew I would just keep putting it off otherwise.
I respect that. I had the mantra for a while, ship it at 80%, because if you try to make something perfect, then sometimes you never ship it at all. So you end up having 0 output. So it's better to have a quick and dirty than no output at all. So good job doing that, and thank you.
Well, with that said, let me throw out the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in economics and foreign policy. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. And I do enjoy the feedback that we get. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard.
Just snuck it in right at the end.
Sometimes I forget.
Well, I'll give you your weekly challenge of 15-minute walk at some point, or walking through Sam's Club, if it's 15 minutes.
Dad did elaborate on that question.
Oh, what did he say?
I think I can see it. He was asking because a JP Morgan report said to take a step back with Argentina, and he was wondering what consequences that would have. Probably not much, because I got to think most of the international private sector is already pretty gun shy with regard to Argentina. I don't think anybody looks at Argentina and thinks that the money they invest there is ever really safe, given Argentina's track record. So there has been some optimism because inflation has come down. There's been a little more growth. But at the same time, it's not clear how long all of that is going to last. And I think JP Morgan is just saying that people are getting a little ahead of themselves. You never really can tell with Argentina. So they'll probably be a little bit reluctant to fully jump into Argentina as far as investing and whatnot until they're more confident about the longevity of the Malay reforms. But otherwise, I don't think it's really going to change much. I think overall, probably there will continue to be optimism, but reserved optimism vis-a-vis investment. JP Morgan probably just kind of pointing out the obvious in that sense.
Cool. Well, with that, thank you, chat, for your participation. Thank you, Fuzzy Cord, for handling questions. Agent Smith, for your expertise and your time. We will see you on the next episode of Well Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
Smith.